The title of my talk is Systemic Functional Linguistics as a Resource in Language Education, System Networks Representing Options in Meaning Making. So that's a conception of language as a resource for making meaning and meaning potential. You've all seen in the abstract, there is a longer version with a list of references if you'd like to see that. I think you all have my email address. In this area of using system networks as a tool in language education, there are a few key contributions, pioneering contributions I'll mention. One is the study of language development. In this instance, I've referenced work on first language development, but really the early stage before very young children move into the mother tongue. Michael Halliday's groundbreaking case study of learning how to mean, starting at the age of about 5 months in the study of one child. That's been replicated since. So using system networks as representations and options and meaning, successive stages in the description of this early language development. So this allows the researcher to view the expansion of the resources for making meaning. A second example, explicitly in L2 education, again, a pioneering study by John Gibbons and Marquis Smith, using system networks as a diagnostic tool in monitoring L2 language development in writing. That was about 30 years ago, and it's a very interesting study to go back to. Another area relevant to our concerns with language education is a line of development that started actually in computational linguistics by John Bateman, Zhengli Chang, and myself, developing a representation of multilingual system networks. So you can represent a multilingual meaning potential, say what a bilingual multilingual speaker has access to, or what a L2 learner is trying to master over time. I'll come back to some of these, but let me just mention a new initiative that involves Winfried and myself and Jorge Arruz-Ita at Complutense University in Madrid. We have a paper coming out in next year, Learning How to Mean in a Second Language, Uses of System Networks in L2 Education. And that's how we conceptualized what is often called second language acquisition. So together with, say, Diane Larson Freeman, Michael Halliday, and so on, we reject this misleading metaphor of second language acquisition and instead use the notion of learning how to mean in a second language. But there are other initiatives Winfried and I are involved in that will develop these ideas. The plan for today is 6 steps. First, the representation of language as a resource using system networks. Then the chronicling of language development using early language development as an example. Then the recording of choices in the unfolding of text, in the processing of text, choices in system networks. The representation of strategies in writing, semantic strategies for developing text in writing. Then fifthly, system networks as a cartographic tool showing maps of resources so we can navigate around the resources, lay them out, and decide on the progression through the description. And finally, the representation of multilingual meaning potential using system networks. So let me introduce the graphic notation for system networks. If you look at the simple display at the left, this actually comes from Halliday's description of early language, what he calls proto-language, before the young child moves into the mother tongue. So you can see that the system network here consists of just 2 systems. The system is defined by the condition under which you make the choice, the so-called entry condition, in this case, interactional. The 2 more options in choice to choose among, in this case, initiation and response. So these are options. Then these terms or options may lead to other systems. So there may be entry conditions in other systems. So if you take initiation, right, there is a choice between friendly and intensified, or normal, friendly, and intensified, impatient. Or this system network, from a description of the post-infancy grammar of English, sort of resources for engaging in dialogue, entry condition clause. Here, there are two simultaneous systems. So that means they're not ordered in delicacy, as in the earlier example. So system networks are not simple taxonomies. You can have simultaneous systems, and they can intersect in different ways. The two simultaneous systems are here tagged versus not tagged, and declarative versus interrogative versus imperative. Let me use the particular system for interrogative, yes-no interrogative versus WH interrogative, as an illustration of how system networks represent parts of the language, and also how options in the system network terms may be instantiated in text. Now, there is one more detail in this representation. You see the choice between yes, no, and WH. So these are the choices in the construction of meanings through wordings in the grammar. But in addition, you have associated realization statements. What do these do? Well, here they specify fragments of the functional structure of the clause in this case, so the unit that the system network has as a domain. So if yes, no in English, that is realized, that's expressed, coded, signaled by putting the finite element of the clause before the subject. So is it rather than it is. If you have a content question, a WH interrogative, that is realized, expressed, signal coded by including an interrogative element, the WH element, and placing it before the finite. Now, typically, the WH element comes first in the clause. Who's coming to dinner? When is he coming to dinner? Why is he coming to dinner? And so on. Let me illustrate this simple contrast between the two types of interrogative, which has to do with what aspect of the clause are you interrogating? What's the focus of the demand for information? The polarity, positive, negative, yes or no, or a participant or circumstance, part of the content, the WH element, who, what, when, why, whither, wherefore, and so on. And have a dialogue from Pinter's early play, The Birthday Party. So let's look at the selection of WH and how it's instantiated in this text. Now, you've seen the realization statement, so that can help us identify instances of WH interrogative clauses, like Meg's, what time did you go out this morning? What time did? That's the realization of the WH interrogative, the WH element what, and its ordering before the finite element did. What time did? And so we can see that this is actually a specification of part of the functional organization, the functional structure of the clause. So here I've shown you the clause with, in reddish background, the interpersonal structure, and in yellowish background, the textual structure, so that you can see that the WH element is also the theme. So again, the realization of WH interrogative is WH before finite, what time did. Okay. Incidentally, this is an area where even advanced speakers of English as a second foreign language have problems. Often they would say, instead of what time did you, what time you went out, or right. So this is an area where you can problematize, you can diagnose issues they have, and you could add a little specification. You can design additional exercises for them to include this in the master of the interpersonal grammar of the language. Yes, no interrogative. Okay. So here you have yes, no, realized by the finite element before the subject. And an example from this dialogue is Meg asking her husband, Petey, was it dark? So that contrasts with it was dark. And Petey responds with a declarative, no, it was light. So again, if you look at this in relation to the specification of the functional structure of the clause, you see that what's specified is the finite before the subject, not their presence, just a sequence, and then in fact both serve as the theme of the clause. So that's a contrast. Just in the choice, what is it you interrogate? What information are you demanding? Now, just to give you a hint of how you can use it when you compare and contrast languages, if you look at the interpersonal grammar of Spanish, you'd find that the system is actually the same. Either you demand information about the polarity, is it positive or negative, or about a participant or a circumstance, a content, a WH element, but there are some differences in the realization. So interestingly, in a Spanish clause, the yes-no interrogative or polar interrogative is realized only by rising tone. Now, in English, you typically have rising tone with the yes-no interrogative, but in Spanish, that's the only realization or expression, indication that the clause is yes-no interrogative. So you can see the equivalent in the translation, and this is a professional translation of the play. Was it dark? Is estaba oscuro? You notice the rising tone, and estaba oscuro contrast with estaba oscuro. So it's just the tone falling for declarative, rising for yes-no interrogative. So you can identify exactly where the languages are similar and differ. So that's a step towards what you might call a 21st century contrastive linguistics in the aid of language education. Now, the system I've showed you, interrogative type, for interrogative clauses, is just one in the whole network representing the interpersonal resources of the clause in English, together with other systems like polarity, positive, negative, mood, indicative, imperative, indicative type, declarative, interrogative. So let me locate it for you in the system network. Before I move on, let me play you about 30 seconds of a filmed version of this play, precisely this breakfast conversation.
What time did you go out this morning, Petey?
The same time as usual.
Was it dark?
No, it was light.
But sometimes you go out in the morning and it's dark.
That's in the winter.
Oh, in winter.
Yes. It gets light later in winter.
Oh.
Fascinating breakfast conversation, isn't it? Now, one reason as a source of illustration, I use Pinter is in a number of his plays, he uses very seemingly trivial dialogue, but to great dramatic effect. So he's a very useful as a way of illustrating choices, in particular, of course, in the interpersonal grammar of the language. And it's been translated into other languages, being Nobel Prize winner in literature. So this is a system we looked at, and you can locate it within the total system. So, for example, when Maggie asks her husband, what time did you go out this morning, Petey? The subject person as addressee, you. The mood, as we've already said, is WH interrogative, and the tense is past tense. So we can locate all the choices that lie behind this particular example. So that was number one, the representation of language as resource. Let me now just briefly introduce and illustrate the chronicling of language development. And I'll use as an example, as I already said, Michael Haddad's case study of one child's proto-language. Now, proto-language, unlike the adult post-infancy language spoken around young children, is a stage of learning how to mean. And young children, starting, say, 5 to 8 months of age in the first year of life, develop this proto-language together with the immediate caregivers. So it's a collaborative, interactive effort, but the child, as it were, takes the initiative. Halliday described the expanding proto-linguistic system. In this case, the meaning is that of interaction. So interaction between you and me. It's a microfunction rather than a metafunction. And he describes this in, as were states of the development 6 weeks apart. So this shows you the timeline from 9 months to 10 months and a half to 1 year, 3 months, to 1 month, 4 months, 1 year, 4 months and a half, right? And what you can see, what this brings out, and I've color-coded this, is the expanding meaning potential. Now, this is a very simple kind of language, a proto-language, but the principle is precisely what I want to illustrate. So you see that the meaning potential keeps expanding. At the very last stage, as a child is at the point of beginning the transition into the mother tongue, which is another phase and takes some time, there is a new kind of phenomenon. So if a greeting is personalized, he's now spliced apart the representation of the person being addressed, Anna, Mummy, Daddy, a small universe of interaction, and a kind of proto-mood. Is he seeking these or is he finding them? So you see there are two systems, simultaneous systems, and it's the first time in the proto-language, because the general principle in the proto-language is you can only mean one thing at the same time. So this is a kind of preview of coming attractions, the coming attractions being simultaneous systems in different meta-functions in the post-infancy adult language. And he does this by teasing apart the expression, articulation for the person addressed, and prosody for seeking versus finding. And this way, then, we can view and chronicle, record the expansion of the proto-linguistic phase 1 resources as the child is about to embark on phase 2. You can see there are expansions in different areas, but the child then begins to, as it were, transform a proto-language into the model spoken around her or him. So that was number 2, the chronicling of language development. Now, let me illustrate the use of sister networks in recording choices and unfolding text. So I already gave you a little taste of this with the example from the dialogue between Meg and Petey and the birthday party. From the point of view of the system network being a source of selections in text, the selections are simply paths through the system network. And these paths are traversals that may be simultaneous. So if you have this angle bracket that I talked about, the curly bracket, sorry, then you may choose simultaneously in parallel in different systems, say in interpersonal, textual, and experiential systems of the clause. You can think of this as successive states of the system network, traversing the system network. And that's what I've tried to illustrate with this figure. So an initial instantial state where you just have a clause, then the clause entry condition to 2 through 3 systems, choices in these systems, then the next state where you access a new entry conditions, so you access new systems for entry conditions, and so on and so forth. And that's what a traversal through system network, through selections in system, choices in system means. Let me illustrate this just for mood, a paragraph in a topographic procedure, a walking tour in part of Hong Kong. So color-coded in light blue, mood, declarative, in red, imperative. So you get a sense of this paragraph, what the paragraph is doing in the topographic procedure. Since it's a procedure, the imperative clauses sort of propel you through this part of the universe in Hong Kong. They're commands, so take a quick look, come back, and so on. And the declarative clauses represent information statements in which the commands occur. So that's a kind of complementarity in the choices on this monologic text. And again, you can locate this in the system network for mood type, imperative versus declarative. So this is a useful way of exploiting text to illustrate points in the overall system of the grammar, the wording potential, the potential for constructing meanings as wordings, and you can connect these two for students so that they can build up the sense of the system through text. Let me choose another example from the grammar of English, and this is now from the textual grammar, where a basic choice is between marked theme and unmarked theme. Theme meaning the orientation of the clause as a message. Now, marked means, among other things, about 10% of the time. Unmarked about 90% of the time. I will represent now for you the whole narrative, a retelling of Noah's Ark for children. So, a traditional story. You look at this, you can see the blue diamonds. They occur at certain intervals. Predominantly selections are unmarked theme. So this is marked theme right at the beginning of the story. And then many selections of unmarked theme. Let me magnify the beginning for you. So you see, you get this pattern of marked theme, unmarked, unmarked, marked theme, unmarked, 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 marked theme, and then quite a few unmarked themes. If you look at the actual narrative, the beginning of the story, you see the first marked theme is once a very long time ago, setting the time period for the whole story. Then all around him, one day, introducing the first episode. So marked themes often have this function in narratives, okay? And then there is a long passage of unmarked themes, and then the very next morning in 18, a new episode introduced. So that's a good way of sensitizing students to the effect of selections in different systems in text. Now, if it was a text of a different kind, like a procedure or say, taxonomic report, the thematic choices would be different, but that's precisely part of the way in through text in different registers or text types. Now we can add something in addition to the visualization of the choices in this way. And this is thanks to a master's student from Brazil who was visiting us here in Spain for about half a year, Teodoro Farhat, Teo. So I said to him, wouldn't it be nice if we could also give a sense of systems being chosen in text musically, so as the options in the system corresponding to notes. This is a service encounter. I won't give you the service encounter. It's a telephonic service encounter, somebody calling up Pizza Hut to order pizza. I just want to suggest how you can use this audio representation to give a sense of what's going on in the text. Have a listen. So this is what happens in a telephonic service encounter. The rectangles are below, these are minor clauses, so used by the interactants, so back-channeling, tracking, saying, I'm with you. So that was the third point, recording of choices and process of text. And that prepares us for the next step, which is to look at the way in which system networks can be used to represent the strategies for expanding text. And then we move up from the lexicogrammar to the semantics, more specifically, the semantics of logical or rhetorical relations. So system networks are writing tools, semantic strategies for expanding text relationally or logical semantically. I won't have time to introduce the different aspects of the full system, but you'll see the number of simultaneous systems. One is multinuclear versus nuclear satellite. So if it's a multinuclear relation, the text segments being related are of equal status. If it's nuclear satellite, then there is one more central text segment, the nucleus, being supported by the satellite in some way or another. But I'd pay more attention to the nature of the logical semantic relation. In particular, I'll illustrate this with respect to expansion. So the text being expanded with a relation of elaborating, restatement, as illustrating, exemplifying, and so on, summarizing, extending, adding, contrasting, and so on, and enhancing spatial, temporal, causal relations, circumstantial relations, enhancing a text segment by another text segment. There are simultaneous systems that we could talk about another occasion, but let me focus on elaborating, extending, enhancing as different kinds of extension. I'll give you an illustration from a text that will then show you how you can grow segment by segment. So an illustration of elaborating. This comes from a factorial explanation. I'll show you the text, build it up for you step by step. So the factorial explanation is about physical weathering. It comes from a study by Robert Veal. So physical weathering, this process is the cause of the breakup of large rocks into smaller pieces. So that's a kind of definition, characterization of physical weathering. That's the most nuclear segment in the whole text. So if you don't know anything else about physical weathering, you'll know that this process is the cause of, etc. There is a local elaboration. Physical processes can cause changes in rocks. So that's an elaboration of the center. But the whole rest of the text is also an elaboration. We'll come to it in a little while. That introduces, in fact, this elaboration, the different factors that can bring about physical weathering. So let us build this up segment by segment through the choice of different relations. So we start with this process is the cause of, etc. And this is the global nucleus of the whole text. It's a definition of physical weathering. And so from the point of view of this text as a text for learning about physical weathering, the readers, the students, can now use this as a growth point for adding new knowledge about physical weathering. So the organization of the text is such that it helps readers learn about physical weathering. So we had this first local elaboration. Then we have an elaboration that introduces the different factors that can be involved in physical weathering. So this is a factorial explanation, as I said. So factors are introduced as an elaboration of the nuclear segment of the text. And they're actually sorted into two sets of factors. And the two sets are introduced by an additive extending multinuclear relation. But the first set you have in three. The most important methods are changes in temperature and the freeze-thaw changes. So you could stop at this point. You know that what the two most important methods are, but that's elaborated. So factors are added one after another in two groupings, and this is the first grouping. So you have elaboration of the two most important ones, and that's predicted already. You can predict how it's organized. You start with changes in temperature cause the rock to expand and shrink. And then there's an elaboration indicating how this happens, the causal relation. And then you have the second most important method, and that's introduced next in this additive. So it says, if water is trapped in a crack on a rock and then freezes, it can force the crack to widen. So that's the second factor. So as I said, a second group now added, and it starts with, there are also 4 other processes, right, etc. And you can predict as a reader that these will now be named. So there's an elaboration, and then just this additive sequence with these 4 other factors, an extending relation. So if you look at the choices from the logical semantic type, expansion, elaborating, extending, enhancing, one thing stands out quite strikingly, and that's the global organization of the text is based on elaboration. So it's the elaboration of the process of physical weathering, introducing the factors. Then in between, you have extending relations, and more locally, you have enhancing relations, causal, temporal relations, conditional relations. Now notice also, as I already said, that the text is constructed in such a way that you can build knowledge out of it. So say as a reader, you student, and you're trying to learn about physical weathering, well, you could use the organization of the text according to the choices in logical semantic type to build up a mind map, sort of a knowledge representation of it. So you learn from the organization of the text that the central node in building up knowledge about it is physical weathering causes large rocks to break up into smaller pieces. And then you have the sorting of the methods of factors explaining this into the two most important ones and four other ones. So you can re-represent this in the mind map. And that can be a very useful way for students to engage with the text and learn by visualizing the knowledge organization of the text in addition to the organization of the text itself. So construing knowledge from the logical semantic organization of the text. Now, we can look above and below. If we look above into context, we see what's going on here. It's expanding knowledge about physical weathering, explaining it using a factorial type of explanation. And in work by Robert Veal and others, this is just a simple contextual structure or schematic structure, phenomena identification followed by factors. Now, what I'm suggesting then is using the representation of the semantic strategies for growing or expanding the text, we can provide much more guidance, more scaffolding to the students. So you can say, if you have phenomenon identification, what are the strategies for expanding this? Well, you can elaborate it by introducing the methods mentioned in the central one, for example. But we can also look below and we'll say, all right, when you learn to write this kind of text, one expanding knowledge by a factorial explanation, also pay attention to the grammatical resources you use, like, for example, cohesive conjunctions. So there's a great opportunity for engaging with cohesive conjunctions. And you learn about also firstly, secondly, thirdly, and finally. So if you look at this bit, you can see how the different conjunctions play a role as clue words in helping readers navigate through the text. This also involves the way that clauses are combined into clause complexes represented as orthographic sentences. So the first reason relation, local reason relation, could in principle be a clause complex. It turns out it's not, and I'll come back to this in a second, or two, or three. But then you can track the clause complexes. So the combining clauses into clause complexes, paratactically, coordination, or hypotactically, sort of dependent relation. And you can see what the resources of clause combining do, the grammatical resources. They serve as guides to the local organization of the overall semantic, logical, semantic, or rhetorical complex. So you have one clause complex, you have another, a third one, fourth one, fifth one, sixth one, and you see they all help guiding the readers through the local organization of the text. But there is an alternative to this kind of congruent realization, semantic rhetorical complex realized by clause complex. You may push it down into the grammar, sort of contract it into clauses rather than clause complexes. And this is very common, of course, in academic writing in general, including scientific or educational version of scientific. So you see the first two. This process is the cause of the breaking up and so on. That is actually metaphorical, and we could go into that, right? Same is true of the second one. But let me use this example. Changes in temperature cause the rock to expand and shrink. A more congruent version of this would be a combination of two clauses. Say, because the temperature changes, the rock expands and shrinks, or the temperature changes, so the rock expands and shrinks. And this would be, say, more likely in a spoken version, more likely with children learning about this before they move into upper primary, lower secondary school. But the representation of this text is as one single clause with the process of changing nominalized as changing. So changes in temperature cause the rock to shrink and expand. So you can contrast these. So what I'm saying is you have the strategies for expanding the text semantically, rhetorically, or logically, or semantically, and then you can look up to the context in which it operates, and you can look downwards to the grammatical realization. Or you could go further into graphology or phonology if it's a spoken text. But note again this tendency for selection of relations in a factorial explanation, macro elaborating, meso extending, so in between micro and macro, and micro enhancing. And that will vary according to the text type, according to the register, the genre. And that is part of what you learn when you expand your meaning potential in the language by adding new registers. So that was fourth. Fifth, as cartographic tool. So system networks as cartographic tool. So that's when we survey the resources that lie behind the choices in the unfolding of text. What you have here to the left is not a proper system network, it's just a representation of the names of systems. The top bit in yellow, these are textual systems having to do with thematic choices. In between red, interpersonal having to do with mood. And then below that, the third cluster of systems, experiential transitivity. And you can locate this in a total map of the language. And in systemic functional linguistics, if you're talking about the grammar, this takes a form of a function rank matrix with the functions, textual, interpersonal, and experiential for the clause, or for combining clauses, logical, and then the different units, the ranks, from clause to group phrase, and so on. And that indeed is a way of organizing the description of the language and are using the system network as a way of navigating around the description. So that's very apparent in Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, and also in a book I published entirely organized around system networks. And because we're mapping out the description of the grammar, I call it lexigrammatical cartography English systems. And if you look at the chapters in IFG, you could locate them in terms of the different systems represented as part of the total resources of the grammar of English. And the area we started with, interpersonal grammar, mood, you can then zoom in and look at this in more detail. You can look at the system networks with examples or links to text and use this as a way of gradually moving through. You could use it, of course, as a way of sequencing aspects in the curriculum. Say we start with more general ones, then we move into more delicate ones, or we focus on certain systems, simultaneous systems first, and then we introduce other systems. So it's a way of curricular, of supporting curricular sequencing relating to text. So that was system networks as a cartographic tool. That, of course, you can extend by including more than one language. And that's the idea behind using multilingual system networks to represent multilingual meaning potential involving 2 or more languages. So that's the final step. So system networks as a representation of multilingual meaning potential. You can think of this as a representation of the personal meaning potential that a bilingual or multilingual speaker has mastered. You can also think of it as the goal that an L2 learner has to strive towards. So you can track the development. You can also use this contrastively to identify where there are similarities between L1 and L2 and differences. So as a kind of systemic functional contrastive analysis. Let me illustrate this very simply from a multilingual system network involving this pronoun systems in English and Indonesian. What you have in blue, that applies to both languages. So that involves, if you have a pronoun, you have a choice in person, interactant, non-interactant, if interactant speaker or speaker plus others or addressee. Then what is not shared is set out in partitions. And these partitions are then conditioned by the language. In this case, partitions for Indonesian, and I set them out in yellow. So what you can see very quickly when you examine this is they share the person system, but with some differences in delicacy as far as Indonesian is concerned. So for example, if it's speaker plus others, Indonesian has inclusivity system, inclusive, exclusive, right? Inclusive we, exclusive we, we're familiar with that. But interestingly, and even more interestingly perhaps, is that Indonesian opens up a whole new vector of choice. So in addition to persons simultaneously with this, Indonesian has a set of systems having to do with the status. So that's an enactment of the tenor relation between the speaker and the addressee. Is the status neutral or non-neutral? If it's non-neutral, is it formal or non-formal? And as I've indicated, right, you can set this out as a matrix or a table showing the different pronouns, realizing these choices in English and Indonesian. So that can be a powerful cartographic tool. Let me return to the area of the interpersonal grammar. Now, with English and Korean and a dash of Mandarin Chinese. Again, the principle is the same. If they're not conditioned, that means that they apply to all the languages involved in the multilingual system network. In pale blue, you have English partition, so they apply only to English. And you note this has to do with the realizations, like the ones we looked at before, elemental yes-no interrogative versus WH interrogative, right? So elemental WH interrogative or yes-no interrogative polar, and you see the realizations are specific to English, as I already hinted at with the example from Spanish. And you can also see that for the clause in general, there is one set of realizations that's specific to Korean, and they have to do with ordering the verbal part of the clause, the predicate, at the end of the clause. Because Korean is a so-called SOV language, the V comes at the end of the clause, okay, with various interpersonal meanings, unlike, say, Chinese and English, which are typologically usually described as SVO languages, or Arabic, modern standard Arabic, which is described as VSO. In any case, you see what's specific to English and Korean and what's shared between them. Again, as with Indonesian, you see Korean introduces another vector, and that is often described as speech level, and it has to do with resources for enacting the roles and relations, the speaker's role in relation to the addressee's role, and has to do with contact and status, so power and contact, as I said, speech level in descriptions of Korean, Javanese, and other languages. So it's either close or distant. If close, familiar, intimate, or plain. If distant, differential, and polite. Now, what this says, and illustrated in the system network, is anytime you make a choice in mood, you simultaneously make one in interactant status, right? And the realization at the end of the clause will depend on the combination of the two. I've illustrated this for two: familiar interrogative and differential interrogative. So that immediately gives you very clear picture of similarities and differences between the two languages. I've also introduced an example from Chinese. English and Chinese, in terms of the system of mood, are similar up to a point, but then there is an elaboration and delicacy for Chinese, the yes-no polar interrogative type, where in Chinese you have to choose what's your expectation as a speaker as to the polarity of the answer. Is it unbiased? That's a shi, bu, shi type. Or is it biased? That's a particle at the end of the clause in Mandarin. So differences may have to do with differences in realization, differences in elaboration and delicacy, and also differences having to do with simultaneous systems. Now, if you're comparing English and Chinese, right, you will find one area where they seem to be incommensurate, and that's a grammatical model of time in the language. In Chinese, it's an aspect model. In English, it's a tense model. So color-coded as sort of rose for Chinese and pale blue for English. And they don't seem to share any potential. That's if you represent this grammatically. So that means you'd have to sort it out in the semantics. And we all know that this is a challenge for learners coming from either Chinese into English or the other way around, because the languages have these two different models. And they sort of represent two extremes when you move across Eurasia. So in Eastern Eurasia, where, say, Chinese and Tagalog, for example, unrelated languages, tend to find aspect models. In Western Eurasia, tense models, and then in between, with Slavic languages, Indo-Aryan languages, and in my view, also modern standard Arabic, models that are mixed tense aspect. So we can reason about this, and we can bring this out in terms of how the languages construe process unfolding through time, English being concerned with the location in time, Chinese with the bounding of the unfolding of the process of the time. So they lead to different basic choices. Location, past, present, future as tense, and Chinese aspect, bounded, perfective, unbounded, imperfective, and then more elaborate choices. So that's the final step, the representation of multilingual meaning potential. In conclusion, I will just come back to the use of the system network in dealing with the unfolding of text. I showed you this for the semantics. I showed you for the choices in the strategies for expanding text through elaborating, extending, and enhancing. But we can move up to the semantics, and we can also see, in fact, that we can represent choices in the context, having to do with what's going on in the context. What are you doing? So let's focus on explaining as a way of expanding knowledge. So you see expanding, then explaining or categorizing. If explaining the different types of explanation, sequential, non-sequential, and if non-sequential, causal versus conditional. If causal, then consequential or factorial. So that's where we have the location of the context for the text of physical weathering. So we can then look through the context and we say, what are the likely schemata for the global semantic organization of the text? And we look at this from the overall potential of the language in its context, the meaning potential in its context of culture, right? And we move through subpotential registers to instances. We can gradually build up a repository of descriptions, and we can identify the way in which language learners can use the exposure to text within different registers to gradually learn more and more of the overall potential. Let me give you one final example of a text unfolding in context. This is now a very different text from the factorial explanation in various ways. I won't read the text to you, but it's just a sense of argument for why the Renaissance happened in Italy, not anywhere else. So again, you can look at this, you get a sense of it by an animation of the gradual expansion of the text. It starts with the thesis, then the evidence for the thesis through an elaboration. And this, as a learner, learning to write historical expositions, which is what this is, you can use this to scaffold, to organize your text. You can start with the more central nuclear element, and then you can think about how you expand them to provide more details, so you don't get lost in the details. Now it ends this text with, which in contextual term is called the reinforcement of the thesis. So the kind of restatement of the full body of the text. If you look at the whole text, you see it begins with a foreshadowing of the theses, a kind of macro theme, but importantly, because it's a persuasive text, it ends with a macro new, which is a sort of interpersonal take-home. It's a claim about why the Renaissance began in Italy, and by the time you reach this, you've had the body of the text to warm you up so that you believe this claim. So what I'm saying is, when we look at these semantic strategies for expanding text, they're used in different ways in different registers. So historic exposition versus a news report and so on. Here are some recent publications, if you like to pursue any aspects of systemic functional linguistics. Much more coming. I talked about the new initiative with Winfried. Many thanks for your attention. This is the end, and now I will stop for any comments, suggestions, discussions. Thank you.